This is a presentation about Australian foreign policy under Prime Minister John Howard. Howard was Prime Minister from 1996 to 2007. He replaced Paul Keating. Howard's counterpart in the Foreign Ministry was Alexander Downer, shown here in an infamous picture. Alexander Downer was one of the few foreign ministers who has served for the entire duration of somebody else's prime ministership. Downer and Howard had the view that Paul Keating had over-exaggerated the importance of Asia to Australia, and so promoted a subtle variation on the Keating foreign policy agenda. Theirs could be described as Asia first, but not Asia only. Howard himself stated, "We did not have to choose between our history and our geography." What he means by this is that we still needed to honour our British heritage, our historic tie to the United States, but that we could always engage with Asia, socially, economically, and politically. Howard's time as Prime Minister saw a number of foreign policy achievements and changes. He is probably most well remembered for his close relations with US President George Bush and UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. During the War on Terror, this was seen as a great asset because all the three leaders worked very well together and seemed to have apparent personal regard. It's also a source of significant criticism for Howard that he was too close to both and uncritical of their decisions. During Howard's time as Prime Minister, Australia came to be increasingly seen as a valuable partner in the Southeast Asian region. This was particularly evident during two events: the Asian financial crisis of 1997, during which many Asian economies went into meltdown. Australia provided valuable assistance in economic aid and recovery. Thailand, Korea, and Indonesia particularly came to appreciate our efforts. We were also appreciated for a massive participation in the post-2004 tsunami relief effort. During this time, we also actively assisted in the transition of Indonesia from a dictatorship under Suharto to a democracy, which it is today. John Howard probably most famously was on a US visit in 2001, which coincided with the September 11 attacks on the Twin Trade Towers on the Pentagon. During this time, the USA came under a bit of a siege mentality, and the ANZUS Treaty was invoked by Howard, and Australia committed to the Afghanistan and Iraq War. This was a controversial decision. Afghanistan firstly was fought on the basis that it was harbouring the Taliban, which in turn harboured the terrorist organisation Al-Qaeda. The logic to this was difficult for some people to fathom, given that the people who had been responsible for the bombing of the Twin Towers in New York City were actually largely from Saudi Arabia, which was the United States ally. We also committed to the Iraq War, and criticisms of this will be considered later in this presentation. During this time, we were widely seen as the US Deputy Sheriff in the Asia-Pacific region. This was even a term which was used by US President George W. Bush. This was sometimes described as the Howard Doctrine, that Australia would be a significant and important ally of the United States, policing the Asia-Pacific region. Howard himself was very uncomfortable with this and the connotation that he himself made few decisions. However, it is certainly a legacy of his time as Prime Minister. During his time as Prime Minister, Howard chaired a Commonwealth group that suspended Zimbabwe from the Commonwealth of Nations. Whilst this was a significant act against the regime of the dictator Robert Mugabe, Howard himself has described this as achieving little else apart from frustration. Howard vigorously pursued a free trade agenda, and he signed bilateral agreements with Singapore, Thailand, and eventually the USA. These have certainly improved Australia's economic position, and you'll note a significant number of products started to come to Australia from particularly places like Thailand. We fulfilled our role as Deputy Sheriff, particularly in regional conflict like that occurred in the Solomon Islands. where Australia sent a peacekeeping force to try to bring things into line. We also took a significant activist stance on corruption during the Pacific, tying Australian aid and assistance to stamping out corruption within government. Famously, during Howard's time as Prime Minister, Hu Jintao, the President of China, addressed an Australian Parliament. So did George W. Bush. This was significant as John Howard believed that it showed that we were balancing our friendship with China with our long-term friendship and alliance with the United States. During Howard's time as Prime Minister, he did attempt to visit India to expand trade and to engage them in what he called a new defence dialogue. This didn't really go very far. However, this idea has been expanded and continued in the time of Julia Gillard. One of the sticking points at this time was Australia's refusal to provide the Indians with uranium, which could be used for nuclear power or nuclear defence. India, which is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Pact, was a controversial nuclear power who is technically outside of the laws of world nuclear weaponry. Howard increased our defence ties with Japan, agreeing to exchange intelligence and to conduct joint operations. This was a pretty big deal in that Japan had always taken a fairly low-key sort of role in terms of its in terms of defence and peacekeeping operations. But at this time, Japan was a little bit more willing to put itself out there, and Howard was part of that. Howard also was seen to have finally removed a stain on Australia by assisting in the United Nations-sponsored East Timorese independence campaign. The United Nations had put it to Indonesia that the East Timorese should be allowed to conduct a referendum to ask whether they wished to become an independent nation or not. Unsurprisingly, they chose to do so, and Australia helped police the transition from Indonesian control to East Timorese independence. The problem, of course, for Australia was, whilst it seemed to fix our relations with East Timor, it did poison things for a little while with Indonesia, a country which had a long-standing relation with Australia. During Howard's time in government, there were certainly some negatives. The government was seen to have swung to the right fairly significantly on issues of asylum seekers. Events such as the Tampa crisis, the Children Overboard affair, and the creation of the Pacific Solution were widely condemned by the Labor opposition. Ironically, these are the exact same policies that Julia Gillard seems intent on implementing now. Howard was seen as being in bed with Bush, who was a very unpopular US president. Howard was seen to uncritically follow the decisions made in Washington without a lot of thought. This was probably the biggest criticism leveled against John Howard and Alexander Downer. Obviously, being a Prime Minister who had committed Australia to 2 wars was a controversial thing. The Iraq War, fought against Saddam Hussein, was based on faulty weapons of mass destruction intelligence which was provided by the United States. Howard was hugely criticised after this for not having conducted our own intelligence, as it was revealed after the war had been fought that Saddam Hussein indeed had no weapons of mass destruction nor the capability of developing them. This was discredited George W. Bush and John Howard significantly, and many people debate as to whether Iraq was left in a better position than it started off. Also, our involvement in Afghanistan was seen as committing Australia to another Vietnam, and the testimony to the fact that we're still there 10 years later is probably support for this view. The biggest point in terms of John Howard's time as Prime Minister was that he created the sense that we could hopefully balance the relationship with China and the USA. This has been the biggest challenge of Australian administrations pretty much for the last decade or so, and probably will be into the future. Balancing our commitment to the US alliance when there are certainly tensions between the US and China is something that will always be a consideration for the Australian Prime Ministers.